Well, hello and welcome to the After the Sermon podcast for Bethany Free Church. We're glad you're joining us this week, especially coming after Easter, and we're excited to get together to just have a little different feel this week. And I'm glad you guys joined us, whether you're joining us listening from Spotify, Apple Podcast, or also as we've been starting to do a video version of it for Facebook, which has been great. Thanks for those that have started joining us there. It's been good seeing a lot of different people joining it and connecting with us in different ways. My name is David Baxley. I'm one of the pastors here at Bethany Church, and joining with us for today is Pastor Billy. Billy is also one of our pastors here. He's our youth and our youth student pastor, right? He's official student pastor, yeah. And then also he was the one that was preaching this Sunday, which was great to have him. And then also we have joined with us for the first time ever, Glenna Leonardson. She's also one of the office assistants on staff. Is that the right official title? Okay, that's good. All right. And so it's good to have Glenna with us too. And, I remember a couple weeks ago when my wife was on, I remember getting specific emails saying, it's so good having a woman's voice in there. Can you have more of that? And as soon as I did that, I'm like, oh, we got to get Glenna in here. Like, you guys don't know Glenna like I do. Like, she is that person. I come in, work, I got to process something. I need to think through something. I go and sit down at Glenna's desk, and I just sit there and we'll chat for 15, 20 minutes, and a lot of the world's problems have been solved there at that location. So I'm glad to have her here, and hopefully we'll do more of that as well. So we're going to kind of build, though, for our podcast today, building from where Pastor Billy was on Sunday, specifically with Easter, and specifically he was developing this specific Bible character, Mary Magdalene. Billy, why don't you kind of review us, set us up to kind of where we were on Sunday and kind of where we're going today.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be able to give this message on Sunday and be able to talk a little bit through Mary. And as you've probably been going along with us, we hope you've been going along with us. And if you haven't, we encourage you to do so. We've been doing this series called Witnesses, those who walked with him, right? And that's been a great journey, being able to hear it from even different pastors, different people, being able to give their perspectives of different characters. And so Sunday, we're building up to, obviously, the tomb, the empty tomb. And probably the greatest witness of the empty tomb would have to be Mary Magdalene. And so that's the witness that we're going to be focusing on that Sunday. And really, as I was preparing and getting ready for this, I really wanted to just really focus on her. Obviously, how she saw Jesus, because he is the reason for it all. But I think trying to see it from her perspective and what she went through in her life, I think has a lot of power to it, a lot of things that we can all relate to, whether male or female. She just brings such a power and an audacious love to the cross and even to the tomb. So, like I said, just really looking forward to sharing that with everyone. So, yep.
All right, where do you want to start today as far as you want to hit discussion or you want to hit some scriptures first?
Yeah, let's go ahead and talk about the scriptures that we're going to be really focusing on. There's two main ones that we're going to be really focusing on Sunday, and it's the Luke account of the woman who took the alabaster jar and broke it and washed Jesus's feet, and I think it's head in that one as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so that story, and I'm going to allude that I really think that this person is Mary Magdalene, and there's some controversy about that we'll get into here in a second. But also are the account of John 20 with the resurrection, the empty tomb. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Luke chapter 7. And really kind of build up to this. So what's going on is Jesus is sitting in a house, right? And he's sitting with, there says in this account that there's Pharisees that are around him. Obviously the disciples were there with him because they were there with him all the time. And what it says here in this account, it doesn't really name the person. It says woman of the city. This woman of the city who had an alabaster flask. And she comes in, like I said, and she breaks that, and she pours it on Jesus' feet. But you could see that the people in the room, just as in every account of this that you have, the people in the room are just blown away that this woman was doing that, and then also that Jesus was receiving it and allowing this woman to do that. And they were just kind of blown away at the fact that this woman, who was known to have a notorious lifestyle, and it doesn't really tell us too much about that, but this lifestyle, and he says if he only knew what she had done in her life, he wouldn't allow her to touch him. And that speaks so much to who Jesus was, because Jesus did obviously know. He knew better than anyone in that room what that woman had gone through. And then he goes in to tell this story about a moneylender who had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other owed 50 denarii. And that's starting verse 41. I tell you what, would you read that for us?
Yeah, I'll read it. So, starting in verse 40, and Jesus answered him, this Pharisee. He said, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he answered, say it, teacher. A certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon answered, the one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And he said to him, you have judged rightly. Want me to keep going? You want to stop there?
No, stop right there.
Okay.
So he gives this illustration of people who are, two people who are forgiven of different debts. And we could talk about the debts here in a second, but kind of want to backstep for a second. I want to talk about how they viewed this woman, because it wasn't a thing to just this woman. It was to pretty much all women, right? This woman specifically had sin in her life, which made it even worse. But I kind of wanted to share a little bit, and I do on Sunday as well, of how they viewed women during that time. And it's just so baffling to us in, I think, our modern, 21st century mind, that people would view women possibly this way. And so I use this character during the early church time. He talks about Mary Magdalene. He talks about the women in the Bible, how much it talks about women in the Bible. And his name was Celsus. And he wrote to Origen, and he said something that was just so crazy. And I want Glenna's perspective here in a second on this, because he said the fact that they use women as a witness in the Bible kind of discounts. And Origen was one of the early church fathers, but he wrote to Origen and said that it makes it seem like the Gospels are gossip because they use women in it. And that's just mind-blowing to me that someone would even say that. But it talks about really during this time in history, and probably largely in history, how women have been treated, and how Jesus was just way above his time. Jesus had to have been crazy above his time, the fact that he used these people, and I think it speaks to the validity of the Gospels, that it does share these stories. But when you hear this, Glenna, does that stick out to you, how the women lived during this time? Is there anything about these stories that really just like, wow?
Well, it definitely sticks out to me that this was a unique woman, because by and large, I think women at that time almost didn't even leave the home that much. They were kind of expected to stay at home. They were expected to not really be able to be that much of thinkers. They were more emotional. And and so the fact that this woman, who obviously is known in her city as not being a good woman, for whatever reason,
Whatever that means.
and then that she has the courage to have found out who Jesus is and found out where he is, and that she has some means, some kind of way to spend money on this perfume that she used. And then to have also, to me, it would have been, in that culture, if I were to put myself in that culture, it would have been very terrifying to go in among the Pharisees. It's one thing to go in to a home, but it's another thing to go in, because these were guys that weren't forgiving or caretaking of anything outside of what was the norm. So there are so many areas where she was very courageous, a very courageous woman.
As you look at that story, and what was that? Knowing it took so much courage, right? So now it makes me ask that question. So what was driving her, right? Like what was? And I suppose that's where we get into the second part of the story here. But to know, like, to not care about anything else, but all she wanted to do was just get there in front of that guy, and whatever was driving her is just, it seems like like you said, it must be such a powerful motivation
Right.
love or whatever it was that was
Right.
really driving her at that time. Just seems incredible.
Well,
It is.
and if you think, if we go with, like Billy said, we don't know this is Mary Magdalene, but we're going to go with that assumption. So now we know she had these demons that were cast out of her by Jesus. Imagine what her life was like before, and now what it's like afterwards.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's why I think it's powerful in putting her in that place and just saying, what if this is Mary Magdalene? It makes sense in the sense that she was forgiven of so much, right? That she had so much that she needed to overcome in her life, and she couldn't do it on her own, right? And then Jesus walks in and casts demons out of her. And this is a really interesting thought. We were just talking about the fact that when it says someone who has a demon, it also, the amount of demons meant that whatever they were doing in their life was something that was a crazy sin. So the more demons someone had, that was probably the more sin that they had in their life, which is kind of brings more to this picture of like, wow, who was Mary? What was she doing, right? It kind of makes you really think of the question. And there's some really interesting history behind, or some people who theorize about who she possibly could have been.
So this is I had a thought. I'm gonna go a little bit here, and you can bring us back when you're ready. But as we read that story, and I was reading this recently before today, and about Jesus making this comparison of who would, how was the question? Which of them will love him more, right? That question of who's been forgiven the most. But then I was taken, all of a sudden reminded the story in John chapter 8, right? So then we have this another woman who's caught in adultery. The religious leaders bring her in front of Jesus, and to stone her, right? Now we know why this woman even needed more courage to come before these leaders, depending on what her sins were, right? That she was battling with. And they're like, hey, this is what the law says, and she's to be stoned. And Jesus' response there was not a comparison of guilt, but is there anybody that doesn't have guilt? And I don't struggle with what Jesus said here, because I know the point he was trying to make to this guy, but it's not that the Pharisee in that room had less sin. It's that he saw or thought he had less sin. Like, I just think that's an important thing to note, is because she had a greater awareness of her guilt before God. In a sense, the greater awareness of guilt means a greater understanding of God's holiness. A greater understanding of who Jesus actually was. So that awareness is what drove her. But the truth is, like Jesus said, who is without sin? And if anyone is without sin, they're just as guilty. The problem is not necessarily who's been forgiven more. The problem is who realizes how terrible sin is before God. And she's someone that sees sin in all of its destructiveness before Jesus, and therefore can appreciate. It's more how she sees sin than she sees herself, right? Because she sees sin as bad as it is. And that's how she can understand, because we've all been forgiven we're all in the same broken place, no matter how bad we've sinned.
Yeah, we're all lawbreakers, if you go with that too. And to what your point, it's a really good example. And I mean, if you contrast Mary to the Pharisees here, the Pharisees, like in Matthew 6, where Jesus talks about them, what were they considered about? They weren't really considered about their stance before God. They were more concerned about way people viewed them, right? Hey, don't be like the hypocrites or the Pharisees who make these loud, audacious prayers, or they make it really apparent that they're fasting and so forth and so forth. And here's Mary. She almost innocently comes into this room, and other accounts say that Jesus' feet, because they would do this, it wasn't a table like we're sitting at today. They would be sitting almost on the ground, and they would put their feet kind of behind them. And the custom was that they would lean on their left arm. So they would have their feet behind them in that way. And she came up washing his feet and breaking this alabaster jar. And obviously, right when that happened, if someone didn't know what was going on in the room, they knew right when she broke this alabaster jar. And she knew that. She had to have known that she's going to be seen, that people are going to know who she was. And it did not matter, because the cost that it was going to take to come out and do this, not just the cost of the actual perfume, but the cost of the social ramifications of doing this. I mean, what if she would have been rebuked? And I think this speaks of someone who knew Jesus highly.
Right.
And because she knew that she can approach Jesus and that he was going to receive her arms wide open.
And every time I see this story, I also think of the incredible humility. I mean, I'm sorry, but we women love our hair. And I can't imagine that it wasn't like that then.
Yeah.
And she used her hair. You know, she used her hair. And to me, it always speaks of this a huge amount of humility between that and then kissing his feet. I mean, we talk, you know, when we tell these stories about Jesus washing their feet, about, you know, how dirty their feet were because they wore sandals, and it was, you know, and yet both of those things to me always say I think they speak of a brokenness, and I think they speak of this, what a contrast from the Pharisees of her humility,
Yep.
her great humility.
Yeah. And I really think that they thought that, you know, do these works to overcome my sinful nature, and that will get me there. Follow the law. And they did. They were very good at following the law. But it was an outward expression, not an inward expression. And here's a woman who definitely experienced that. And it goes to speak about the debt here. The debt here. She had a great understanding of the debt that was paid for her. And I love what you said there, David, because it's so important for us to realize that we're no different than any other sinner in this world.
Yes.
Right? And we are lawbreakers. We break one law, we're the same as the person who's broken 1,000,000 times. And we don't like that, because what it is, it's a comparison to me and you.
Yeah.
When it's a comparison between us and a totally righteous, perfect God.
Yeah.
It's not a comparison to me and you. It's a comparison to him. And he's saying, no, you are unrighteous. You don't meet my standard.
The temptation is, and I think we all witness this, in principle, and I say this in quotes, right? In principle, we would know none of us can be as good as God. But our entire sinful nature wants to validate ourselves, right? And so if I can't validate myself by comparing myself to God, the only way I can find a way to validate myself is to compare myself to others. And so we walk around, and we either will say, all right, I want to be more like that person, so how do I copy them? But we're more likely, because that's too much work, we're more likely to say, at least I'm not like that person. And again, a reminder of that story of the Pharisee that prayed, and Lord, I thank you that I'm not like that person over there, I'm not like that person over there. And then the contrast of the tax collector that comes and can't even look up to heaven, and he beats his chest and he says, have mercy on me, God, I'm a sinner. And that contrast of realizing, and you said it well, is that until I'm willing to, like, all of us should be like Mary. Like, Mary didn't need to do what she did because she had greater sin. Mary is the example of what all of us need to understand, what it truly looks like to be brokenness and to have humility in the reality of our sin before a holy God. Like, she's not the example of what that other person over there needs to be because they've had a worse life. Yeah. She's the example of what every single one of us has to see about our sin. And if we don't, we're closer to like the Pharisees. Yeah. If we think Mary's an exception and she's one of those, we're actually more like the Pharisees than we are like Mary. And I know that I can easily fall into that trap because my wife will tell you, my brain works in comparisons. That is what I do, and it is such a dysfunction. What?
It's easy to do.
Yeah.
Right? And we can get trapped in that. And so it's good to be rooted in God's word. I think one of the most conflicting verses for me is where it says, but he who forgiven little loves little. You know, right there in, 49? No, 47, my bad. Right. Luke 7. And so where it is pointing at this, I think that to me is like, man, when I'm not forgiving, it means that I feel like I've been forgiven a little. And some of the greatest moments in my life are when I was able to overcome my bitterness, my hurt, you know, like the things that I experienced with my father growing up. That's probably a big one for me. And I remember that sticking out to me a lot. Like, how much have I been forgiven of? Let's not focus on how much this person's hurt me, but when I focus on what God has given me, it helps me love so much more. And I mean, the Bible speaks in this all over. It's riddled with these passages. You know, you love because he first loved you, right? We're only capable of understanding what agape love is, unconditional love, when we know and experience God's love. And I think Mary exemplifies that probably than better than any character in the entire Bible. And again, it's so amazing that we have a text that was 2,000 years ago. I challenge someone to find another text that has women as characters like this that stick out of the pages like they do. They don't exist.
Throughout the New Testament.
Right.
New Testament.
Yeah.
And it's not just Mary. I think she's kind of a leader among that. And I mean, even the Old Testament, which goes even further back,
Yeah.
has some of those people.
Yeah, it does. You're right. Yep.
But again, and I think this is what's happening. God is redeeming women in that nature, right? And yes, we have a lot of people want to point to the garden and hold so firmly to that, but I see God redeeming women and bringing them into the fold. And that's really what brings me to that story around the tomb.
Yeah,
And why
yeah.
he used Mary. It's not a happenstance that Mary was that person there. There's no way it's a happenstance.
So remind us of that real quick, and just in case we
Yeah.
missed the sermon, go back to where
So-
you're talking about the tomb.
So in the story of the tomb in John 20, and honestly, that this portion I would say we could read a little bit. Glenn, I don't know if you have your Bible open or not. Or would
I do.
mind reading.
Yep.
If you would just read 1 through 10 there.
Okay. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going toward the tomb, both of them running together. But the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first, and stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, and he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb. How far did we want to go?
That's good for right there. And so I want us to keep in mind who Mary was, what she went through, and here she is. She's coming to the tomb. And what's interesting is I love that John just focuses on Mary, even though she was not the only woman there. And even in this text it gives you, when she comes back, she says, "We cannot find him." So,
Yep.
but the other gospels say other women were with her. She
Right.
comes back and she's the only one with the other disciples at that point in that time. And this is the other thing that's really interesting. So in this first day, it was very early on. It was the last watch, okay, in the Roman culture. That was somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So crazy early. And idea there is probably her and the other women, they couldn't sleep, right? They're thinking about Jesus. They're thinking that he didn't get a proper burial. That's why they're bringing spices, as we hear from other gospel accounts as well. And so she's coming to this thing, and it kind of put this in mind. A lot of people look at this and they say, aha, that's why this story isn't true, and the skeptic will point at these things. But remember, what was going on at the tomb? What was there? Anybody remember?
Talking about the stone.
The stone.
Yep.
Which
Soldiers.
soldiers, right? So did anybody know how much this stone probably weighed?
A lot.
2
It
tons.
was around 2 to 3 tons.
There you go.
Wow.
All right, and it had a trough that would run down into it. And people say, we don't know that. It's like, no, the historians say every single tomb that dates during that time would have been around that time. If somebody owned it, it was a family tomb, and it could have been a place where other bodies might have been inside it and everything
Yeah.
too. But that was only a holding place for a while, and then they would put the bones after a while in a box. All right?
Oh, okay.
So there's a lot of different things that we can understand through this story and the history. But how did Mary and the other women think they were going to get in that tomb?
Yeah.
Right? They didn't. And here's what I would say is, one, they might have not known. They might have not known
Yep.
if the Roman soldiers were in it. That's possible. They might have known, might have been able to convince the Roman soldiers to get out. Maybe they're thinking, hey, let us finish this proper burial and all these different things. We're just women. We're not trying to steal the body or anything like that. And here's what I really think, though, is love doesn't think about those details. They just went. And that was Mary's character. Think about it. I'm not concerned about the social ramifications of this. I'm not concerned for my own well-being. I love Jesus. And here's the difference. Everyone else is in disarray.
Right.
And
That's
yet
what I
the-
thought of.
And yet the women come.
Yeah.
Right? So let's speak a little bit of that nature.
Yeah, the guys are all hiding.
Yeah.
That's what I thought. You know, even at the cross, to some extent,
Yep.
most of the guys were hiding.
Yep.
They were afraid. She was one of the followers of Jesus, just like they were, and yet she stayed.
Yep.
She stayed, and I think, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, but I think she even stayed to during the time when they took his body off the cross and were
Preparing
taking
them.
it. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So, you know, again, I think she was a very unique, courageous woman.
She was. And to think about it, like she didn't have a husband, right?
Yep.
She didn't have someone who in their state of mind would have said to speak on behalf of you.
Yeah.
You know, she didn't have that. She had some money, which was pretty clear. She might have spent it all following Jesus up to this point. Who knows, right? Joseph of Arimathea, who you talk about the day before,
Yep.
right? He's the guy who pays for the tomb and buys the rights to go and bury him, which is a pretty audacious move for him,
Right.
even too. But we have this woman who she shows such courage and such audacious love and concern for Jesus, even after the cross. To her, death was not going to stop the fact that Jesus was her Lord, right? And which is powerful to think about. I mean, the resurrection makes it all. But she had such a relationship with Jesus that he was God.
And it paints a picture of her spiritual maturity, and in a sense that her, not by position but by decisions, was a spiritual influence, right? Like she was someone that was saying, man, and what happened when she comes back and says what went down? All the disciples are like, we got to listen to Mary, right? So she wasn't just like, again, the way even, and what that tells me is not only is who she was, but the way Jesus probably also treated her. The way Jesus, and he taught his disciples to treat her. She was a part of this family, and it wasn't this hierarchy mentality of the men and the women and, you know, that idea, but the fact that she was walking alongside them, she was doing life with them, you know, and all that type of stuff like you described, and maybe a contributor to the ministry of Jesus, right? And that's actually several, if you look at the history of that, you actually find that, I don't remember if it was you and I were talking about that or someone else, but that a lot of Jesus' ministry was probably financed by women.
Yeah.
That they were the ones that were actually bringing a lot of the money, donations, and stuff to the ministry of Jesus, that without those women's and their influence and what they were bringing, again, the ministry wouldn't have been that same. They wouldn't have had what they needed. And so just the nature at which this group worked was completely, even in the temple, they couldn't go into the same places.
Yeah.
But when it came to the relationship with Jesus, because that wasn't even the way they designed the temple wasn't even God's design. That was something they had manufactured in their own culture, the way of doing it, because of the way they wanted to segregate men and women. But Jesus was like, no, you're all sitting around here, right? Go back to the story of Martha and Mary, right? Martha's doing the serving thing, and she was doing probably what she believed was expected of her. This is not like a judgment on her in
The way
that
she was probably loving Jesus.
yeah,
honestly.
yeah. But he's like, but yet the greater thing is come sit down with everybody else
Yeah. And where was Mary at when that happened?
at
Do
the
you know?
feet
At the feet of
of
Jesus.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Here's what I want to say. I want to say something. It might be a little bit bold, but I think it's something that needs to be said. A lot of times, I think our culture exemplifies this idea of what a man looks like, and it's this idea of a brash person, someone who has to be the loud one, the person who leads up front, and there's no real meekness in that sense. And yet, Jesus, the reason I think he really stuck out to be the person he was is because how he treated women and children. I think there's power to that, right? And it's crazy to me that we're 2,000 years removed, and I really think that we still struggle with this in churches.
I agree. Absolutely.
You know, we tell women things like, hey, go home, right? And that's not okay. And I don't think that's what Jesus exemplifies here. I think he exemplifies someone who has great concern and draws people into the narrative. He draws people into the commission of Jesus. And here's the thing, in this story we're about to read the fact that Mary was the first person who was commissioned by Jesus after his death.
Let's go into that right now.
Yep, let's do it.
So what, start verse 11 again, or 12 for Glenna, wherever you, John 20,
Just start in 11.
11, okay.
But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white standing where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she didn't know that this was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I am not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and that he had said these things to her.
Very good. So there's a lot here. It seems like a pretty straightforward story, but there's a lot in this. And we have to kind of like put yourself in the narrative, which I love, and that's the whole point and the premise of doing what we're doing this Easter is witness it from their behalf, right? So what happens is Peter and John, they leave. And so if you don't know, John the Beloved is the other one, and I think it's hilarious that he mentions that he beat Peter to the tomb. It's pretty funny. He's like, "And I beat him, and I still remember it." But then he comes into this story about Mary and that she was there after Jesus appeared to her, and she has this very special moment. Up until this point, she was not the only witness. In this moment, she is the only witness of what happened. So it was something that had to have been told afterwards to John. And John must have had a pretty amazing relationship with Mary Magdalene too, because, hey, they were the only ones outside of Mary, mother of Jesus, who was there, right? And so to me, it makes sense that John puts a lot of emphasis on who Mary was. I witness what you witness, right? We're co-witnesses in this situation. And so now it goes into this really amazing story where she looks into the tomb and she sees the two angels sitting at the feet of Jesus. This is where it gets really, really cool. A lot of people think that this is a depiction of the Ark of the Covenant. Because
with the two angels on each
the two
end.
angels on both
Oh,
sides,
yeah.
right? Which is really cool, right? Maybe not, right? And they ask her, "Why are you crying?" Right? And and I think that she was so baffled that Jesus' body was not there that she was in the right state of mind. Because what happens in almost every other situation when angels appear? What do people
You're
do?
afraid of the angels.
They fall to their face.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so this was probably that, but she was so distraught. And guys, when they cry, it happens too, but I think it happens more with women, and maybe it's in our modern time, mascara and stuff like that. But what happens when women normally cry, right? I mean, it's all out, waterworks, right? And it's typically, you can't see, I've been there in my life. That's happened
I
to
was
me
about to say,
before.
man, what about when I cry? Like, hey.
Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just me now as I'm older. So, I don't know. Like I try to suck it up. Gotta be tough. But I do cry.
He's not completely dead inside.
Yeah, and but I see this person who is so distraught, and then Jesus comes up to her, and he's talking to her, and she thinks he's the gardener. And a lot of people think he must have been hiding behind a bush. You see a lot of depictions of that and stuff, and he's like trying to be kind of sneaky, which actually seems Jesus' kind of ritual from that. If you go to like the road to Damascus and he hid himself,
Yeah.
from them, he kind of wanted that surprise, And I imagine Jesus having that kind of sense of humor, like, ha, I'm here. But that's my cartoon brain.
Wow. Wow. See, my cartoon brain doesn't do what Billy's cartoon brain
That's the
does.
student pass.
Yeah. Billy's like, so I'm going to be like Jesus and scare kids.
Look, you thought I died. So,
Wow, all right.
Maybe, who knows? Maybe Jesus was a prankster, maybe he wasn't,
Well,
right?
as I read this, even as Glenn, as you were reading it, when we got to verse 16, and Jesus said to her, Mary, and I got goosebumps just because, I haven't read this in a while, and I'm just thinking, like, I'm just hearing Jesus like, Mary, like it's me, like, that with that almost anticipation of like, don't you recognize me, that, and just that the friendship tone I hear in that, like,
Yeah.
if I hadn't seen a friend in such a long time, and I go up to them, they're not quite paying attention, and they're like, yeah, I'm looking for my friend David, and I just look at him and say, hey, dude, right? Like, I'm right here, right? And then just the rejoice where he's like, where Jesus has got to be like, how excited she was, how much she loved her Lord. She must have been jumping up to hold him, to hug him, right?
Yeah.
And as the hugger in the room right now, I can totally relate to that, right? Just like,
And Jesus rebuked her.
yeah, no. Well, I don't think that's fair application, but but right, I could just put myself there. You said put yourself there, Billy. As Glenn was reading that, I
It's
did.
such a beautiful
and my heart was just moved. Like, man, I can't wait to see Jesus like that. Like, I know it's kind of a little side thing right here, but I'm so jealous
Yeah.
of her as I even imagine this, like, the relationship she had with him, and oh man, it just makes you long for the mission that he gave her, like, and that's where you were really going with it. But the uniqueness of his relationship with her, how he saw her, how he understood her in light of what was about to begin, in light of the church,
Yeah.
and how this was the beginning moment
Yep.
of he is risen.
Yep.
Yep.
And I'll speak a lot to her fearless nature, and that got her to this moment. Jesus' first commission was to her, go tell the disciples that I'm here. And back to that whole example of women are called into it. And she was actually at his ascension. He was there. She was there.
Yes.
Right? And we can't forget this. Like, women are a part of spreading the good news of Jesus Christ. She was literally, a woman was the first one
Yes, to see him.
see that and to share.
He's the
good
first
news.
evangelist to be able to say he was risen. He was the first one to
The very
ever
first one.
share that word.
Yeah, so and I would just say that to my female counterparts, right? Co-heirs to the kingdom, I would say, you don't lose that. Don't let anybody take that from you. I don't care if they're your husband. I don't care who it is. You are co-heirs to the kingdom, and you have to spread the good news. It's not just a male thing. We have to do this together.
And Glenn, I'm just curious, as you've been around church world a long time, so if I'm setting you up here, give me like a kick in the shin if you don't like the question. But you know me well enough, you know where I'm going. Is how can we as a church, a culture of Christianity, but our church really, how can we be better at realizing what God wants us to see in light of His own relationships with His followers, the way Mary is talked about throughout scriptures, and how we can help bring that same narrative, that same encouragement to the challenge. I was at, and I think I remember I was told that was at the national conference, theology conference for the EFCA, and one of the challenges they said to the pastors was, pastors, you often have a problem where you only disciple 50% of your body, because you have an emphasis of discipling men often over women. And I just would be curious, like, what is it we can do, or what would you want to encourage women to know about that, to just say, here's how we can respond in light of Mary's example?
Yeah.
I think it's twofold. To some extent, I think women need to be willing to study and learn and be in a place where they are speaking for God, speaking for Christ in every setting.
Yeah, ambassadors.
And I think to some extent, I think it's a little bit, and some people might not like me saying this, but it's kind of a chicken and an egg thing, because women haven't been given that place, they haven't fought to have that place. And so I think, first of all, it's just taking that step and saying, I am a co-heir. I am just as valuable to God as anybody else. And so what I've learned, what he's teaching me are things that I need to say and do boldly, just like Mary. I need to do it
Yeah.
boldly. And then I think also that we need to begin, as you said, as you learned at this conference, to kind of be given that permission to some extent
Yeah.
in the churches where they haven't been acknowledged as being co-heirs. I think it's kind of like, yeah, you are, but you kind of aren't. And so I think it's women stepping forward with grace and with love, and men and leaders saying, you're co-heirs. You're part of this. We want you to be part of this.
And to hear, for those listening, just as we're kind of winding down here, but as you've heard from Billy, his heart for this already, right? Billy, that's why he's teaching this, partially, is because to show this radical message of the gospel. When we did the marriage series a couple weeks ago, you heard my heart on this as well, on how we've approached the curse in the wrong way. We've accepted living in brokenness in this narrative instead of realizing the redemption power of coming back to the way God designed us to live in relationship with each other within the body of Christ. And so just to know that I want to encourage you to step out like Mary. And if you're not sure, know that at least here with us as pastors and this is a safe place. I mean, this is such an important part of how we speak. Glenn is actually on our preaching team because of the beautiful wisdom that she brings, her knowledge of Scripture, the insight she has, the perspective she has, both as a person but also as a woman, and all this other stuff that we, and I say this, we as a collective church are in desperate need to be the complete body of Christ, and both in the image of Christ, of male and female, but the image of what Mary brought. Can you imagine if the disciples had followed their religious cultural standards of women instead of letting Jesus lead them to something different. And how powerful the one. You want to add anything else before we close here?
Yeah, I do. I want to say this. See, this is where, I love what you said there. The cultural positions that people have put women that were never meant by God.
Yes.
But yet there's some positions that are meant for all people, whether male or female, and it's definitely at the feet of Jesus.
Yeah, that's good.
And it's also spreading the good news of Jesus Christ. And then he's going to take that and he's going to uniquely put us in a place that we are best to serve him in ministry. And that's not a thing for just male or female, it's for both of us. And when we find that, and we find that we're not disconnected, but we are connected in our unique area and places of ministry, there's nothing that can come against Christ and his body. And this exemplifies that in this story, and I think it's so beautiful. There's so many different little things that I nerd out on. The fact that he says, don't touch me because I haven't ascended yet, and then the very next day, Thomas and everyone touches him. When did he descend, right? But
Billy's politely hinting, I think, at me for a part 2 and a part 3 and part 4 of this podcast.
We do this every time, and we never have it. So I hope that stirs the hunger in y'all. I hope there's enough practical nature to this to where you walk away and says, not the Easter story I thought, but the Easter story I needed to hear today.
That's a good word. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. Glenna, thank you for being a part of this.
You're welcome.
And as I expected, you were fantastic to bring on, and we'll be asked to come back again soon, which I'm excited about. So, again, thank you for listening. We'll be picking up next week. We'll be getting back in our series as a church going through the book of 1 Peter, and we'll be getting into chapter 5, the last chapter, and we have a couple more weeks left, and then we'll be going on to the next series that God's taking us to as a church. But thanks for listening. If you have any questions about what's going on, feel free to ask us, email us, contact any of us, and love to help answer those questions, either an email or even on our next podcast. But God bless, and just continue to have a great week with him. Live in the joy that came out of Easter this week as you just celebrate that he has risen, the life he has, we have as we walk with him every day. Thanks so much.